Well, good evening, everybody. It's very nice to see everybody here. My name is Glenda Abramson, and on behalf of the Oxford Interfaith Forum, I would like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us for what promises to be a unique and wonderful evening. The very first event I had the privilege of attending at the Oxford Interfaith Forum was Professor Eitan Fishbane's discussion of the mystical interpretation of Psalm 33 a little while ago. Therefore, I'm very delighted and honored to be introducing him this evening. Professor Fishbein is Associate Professor of Jewish Thought at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, where he teaches courses on Jewish mysticism and spirituality. He's had an extremely distinguished career. He's the recipient of grants from the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and was a recipient of the Charles A. Rice Camp Fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies. He's published major academic studies on Jewish mysticism, topics that range from medieval Kabbalah to modern Hasidism. Among his works are the Art of Mystical Narrative, A Poetics of the Zohar, another one, As Light Before Dawn, The Inner World of a Medieval Kabbalist. He's currently working on several book projects, one of them a theological commentary on the Torah cycle and the Jewish holidays, entitled Written on the Heart, Meditations and Readings. But this evening, the launch is of a very different style of book, although the content still reflects Professor Fishbane's central interest. It's a book of poetry entitled Embers of Pilgrimage, published late last year, which we're launching this evening. In his lecture on Psalm 33, Professor Fishbane, if I may say, Eitan, in keeping with the celebratory nature of this evening, Eitan said that poetry is a gesture towards the ineffable. And he also went on to say that poetry is emotion in quest of words. Well, in this book, the subject of this evening's launch, the poetry certainly deals with the ineffable in many ways, and it has certainly found the words. It's not only infused with the mystical thought that is central to his academic work and his teaching, but it's also deeply personal, a meditation, as Rabbi Aubrey Glazer has written, on the existential questions of human life. We're delighted to have two other eminent scholars with us this evening who will speak about Eitan and his poetry. The first is Rabbi Aubrey Glazer, who will say a few words, and then Dr. Biti will follow. If some technical, I see that Dr. Roy is there, so obviously the technical problems have been solved. She will follow, and then Eitan himself will speak on his own and together with Rabbi Aubrey. So now I would just like to introduce Rabbi Aubrey Glazer. Sorry, let's just get this page. Aubrey L. Glazer, who likes to be known as Rabbi G or Rav Aubrey, which is the form I prefer, has served as senior rabbi of numerous congregations from the West Coast to the East Coast. And he's also founding director of Panui in San Francisco, an incubator for contemplative practice and conscious community building. Rav Aubrey is a fellow of both the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem and the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. He's passionate about piyut, that's Jewish liturgical poetry from Sephardi, Mizrahi, and Israeli origins, and jam bands. And I had to look that up, meaning improvisation that often crosses genre boundaries, and he plays the hand drums. He's passionate about fly fishing, hiking, and meditating in nature. Rav Aubrey is a teacher in demand in many contexts, from federations to rabbinical seminaries to universities and Jewish meditation retreats. He combines his love of music and mysticism, as we see in two of his acclaimed books, Tangle of Matter and Ghost, Leonard Cohen's post-secular songbook of mysticisms, Jewish and Beyond, and God Knows Everything is Broken, the great Gnostic American songbook of Bob Dylan, and I'm sure many other public publications. Rav Aubrey wrote the introduction to Embers of Pilgrimage, which is being launched this evening, and I would like now to call on Rav Aubrey Glazer.
Thank you, Glenda and Thea. It's really wonderful to be here across the universe together in this very precarious time with my dear friends and colleagues, both with Eitan and with Biti in Yerushalayim. And I have to say that it feels somewhat surreal, but it's the only thing I feel on a certain level, aside from prayer, that is left for us in these very terrifying moments, to turn to poetry in the hour of war. And it feels to me that there is something remarkable about the powerful mystical vision that I want to share a little bit about from my perspective, and then Biti's going to share from her perspective, that I hope brings us a sense of purpose, a sense of groundedness amidst these moments where we feel like everything is unknown, and we can hear the soldiers marching on, and the blood and the devastation really is the other side, in many ways, of this title that Eitan has shared. I've been reflecting a lot on the book, Eitan, and as I speak, if you want to respond, you're welcome to, because you and I have an ongoing Sprachdenken, a kind of dialogue in the world of poetry. So feel free, if you want to respond, or if I engage you to share where you're at as a poet and in the process. But it feels as though, because Embers of Pilgrimage struck me when I first read it, and it struck me like a diamond in the heart. There was something so direct about the way Eitan writes, and his ability to be able to bring the lyrical landscape of the greatest romantic and lyrical transcendentalist poets of America into conversation with the deep treasure trove of Jewish mysticism that Biti is gonna touch on. I want to touch more on the Americana Jewish side of what Eitan is doing. And to do that, I'm going to be a bit of a provocateur, but I also want to acknowledge that we live in this moment, first, of the terror of war, and that our conversation tonight should be dedicated to really uplifting the souls of all those who are fighting for freedom and who are fleeing. In many ways, this is kind of like a moment of the partisan song that Leonard Cohen wrote. And I just feel for what's going on in a very poetic way, that the words of poetry emerge from the embers. And this is part of the first image that I had in mind, was just of all the images of devastation. The Embers of Pilgrimage that I always imagined in this book, that I encourage everyone to uplift and to really rejoice with, was always an image for me of a quest towards something within the American landscape, and the struggle to be able to find the hidden gems of poetry amidst the death and the rebirth of the American dream. And it's a common theme that I reflect on a lot. And there's something about Eitan's poetry when I first read it that really struck me, that no other poet is really doing what Eitan is doing right now, in this unique ability to be able to paint from a poetic palette that draws, as I mentioned, the depth and the breadth of Jewish mysticism in a really tender and subtle way, by translating it into an English that we can sing, as well as in many ways really reacting to. And here I take my cue from my friend and teacher Harold Bloom of blessed memory, that we're all experiencing a kind of anxiety of influence. Strong poets are always influenced by the poets that come before them, and I would dare suggest tonight that Eitan is one of those strong poets who is deeply under the influence of some of the greatest American poets. And I'll read you a section of an excerpt, and we'll see if people can hear the words. This doesn't come from Embers of Pilgrimage, but at least not from this edition of Embers of Pilgrimage, but it comes from what I would call an earlier iteration of Embers of Pilgrimage from May 1865. And I'll read it, and then I want to see if Eitan wants to engage about the poetic process himself, and just the larger question of pilgrimage for words of poetry in the time of war. A march in the ranks, hard pressed, and the road unknown, a route through a heavy wood with muffled steps in the darkness, our army foiled with loss severe, and the sullen remnant retreating till after midnight, glimmer upon the lights of a dim lighted building. We come to an open space in the woods, and halt by the dim lighted building. 'Tis a large old church, and at the crossing roads now an impromptu hospital. Entering for a minute, I see a sight beyond all the pictures and poems ever made. Shadows of deepest black, just lit by moving candles and lamps, and by one great pitchy torch stationary, with wild red flaming clouds of smoke, by these crowds, groups of forms vaguely I see on the floor, some in the pews laid down, at my feet more distinctly. a soldier, a mere lad in danger of bleeding to death. He's shot in the abdomen. I staunch the blood temporarily, the youngster's face is white as lily. And before I depart, I sweep my eyes over the scene, fain to absorb it all. Faces, varieties, postures beyond description, most in obscurity, some of them dead, surgeons operating, attendants holding lights, the smell of ether, the odor of blood. The crowd, oh, the crowd of bloody forms. The yard outside also filled, some on the bare ground, some on planks or stretchers, some in the death spasm sweating. An occasional scream or cry, the doctor shouted orders or calls, the glisten of the little steel instruments catching the glint of the torches. I resume as I chant. I see again the forms, I smell the odor, and then hear outside the orders given. Fall in, my men, fall in. But first, I bend to the dying lad. His eyes open, a half smile gives he me. Then the eyes close, calmly close, and I speed forth to the darkness, resuming marching ever in darkness, marching on in the ranks. The unknown road is still marching. So Eitan, do you recognize where this anxiety of influence comes from? And then I want to turn to one of your poems and talk to you about it. But do you feel the resonance of this anxiety of what I just read for you?
It's Whitman on the Civil War, right?
It is. So it's an earlier pilgrimage with its embers that I think are still very much alive in North America and globally around the world now in this time of war. It was called A March in the Ranks, Hard Pressed, and the Road Unknown, that he wrote as part of drum taps. And every time I read your poetry, and I hear the voice of Whitman coming through. And just to give readers and those joined with us today an example of how diverse and how creative Eitan's work is, I want to open up to you, Eitan, to see if there's anything that you want to share within the collection that you feel channels part of the spirit, and if not, I'm thinking of specifically a section that one of my favorite cycles in the collection called Faces. And when I was looking at the first face, there's 5 faces that are spoken of here, and Biti will talk about these divine persona as different facets of the divine. But I think of writing poetry in a time of war, and I think of what is the facet or the face, as it were, of God that presides over this moment of war. If God really is present in everything and in all things, then even in this catastrophe that we're seeing unfolding before us, whether it's now in the districts where in Kiev and in the Ukraine, whether it was in the moments of the Civil War that Whitman was witnessing in that moment of his own pilgrimage, and Eitan, in your own unique, small, collected ways of traversing travesty and catastrophe, there's always these moments where we wonder, where is God in this moment? And I think all religious seekers of not just the Abrahamic faiths, but of all traditions, grapple with this question when we are in a time of war. Where's the presence of God, if there is a presence, and if it's not completely eclipsed? So I turn to your poem, and maybe you'll read a bit of it for us, and we can talk about it for the few minutes that remain in my time, because I find it really provocative, and I find solace in poetry in these moments. But I was looking at Faces, and on page 59 and 60 is the first face called Zeir Anpin. And my understanding of part of the challenge of being able to translate it, which you do so eloquently in the first line, and maybe you'll read it and share with us your reflections on it. But the first line you write, quick to rage, temper unrestrained, God of wrath and vengeance. This is the facet of Zeir Anpin. And in this moment right now that we are in, watching all these images that are so horrifying, I feel the presence of Zeir Anpin. And I just wanted to put it out there. I've given a little bit of Whitman, a tiny bit of Zohar, and of course, we're here to really appreciate the depth of your creative process. So if you want to share a couple lines perhaps from Zeir Anpin and how you were able to capture this remarkable almost interpolation of a translation that is so hard to get to, because we know that literally the short-tempered face or the impatient one doesn't really convey the depth of what you've captured here. So do you have any reactions to the process of writing something like this, and even how it strikes you now reading poetry in a time of war. Do you want to read a tiny bit of it and maybe reflect on it with us?
Yes. I was actually trying to think about whether I wanted to do a reading of the full poem of Faces a little bit later on.
Okay.
And I could potentially read some of the Thanksgiving poem now, which I think also relates a lot to some of that. But just to talk about it in a bit of a meta way as well. I think that part of what I've come to realize in my own process in writing this was this navigation between attempting to reach with the tools of art, with the tools of words toward the ineffable, or to put it in mystical terms, right, through the letters, the mystery of the letters, toward the infinite nothingness of being. But I could certainly read a couple of lines from Faces, if that would be more apt to your setup in terms of the time frame that we have right now.
Yeah, that would be great. Read a couple and then maybe just talk as a foretaste for the fuller reading later. The process for you, the creative process, just to give us some insight into how these words emerge for you and what you want to share, what strikes you about it now in this moment.
Yeah. All right, so I'll just skip around with a couple of lines here, but first Zeir Anpin, which perhaps Biti will have some thoughts on later. I don't know, but it's a dimension within the Kabbalistic vision of divinity. The shortened face, the masculine, the stereotypically masculine face. Quick to rage, temper unrestrained, God of wrath and vengeance. He is youth, black-bearded, passion and masculinity. He is the impatient one, judgmental Father God. He is bitter anger embodied in the resounding here below. Now he is softened by his lover. She that was carved out and severed from his own self, his life force released and streamed into her. Nukba, my gentle love, your hair smooth and soft, and then thrown across my face in the sweaty tangle of sex. Close, so close. He that knows his heart, he knows that his heart is full of gentleness and love. It is. She knows it too. She who keeps his secrets. And then just jumping ahead a little bit. Grace overflowing, eternal calm, God like man, reaching with luminous yearning for the face of his best self, his higher self, tranquil as waters untouched, and turning to the brilliant, undifferentiated light, rivulets of radiance, where all things merge into one. He says the prayer, he prays the words, set me free, with countenance and palms turned up, like a dreamy supplicant to the sun or to the source of all shining. From the prison of impatience and rage, liberate me now and wash me clean with your pure stream of love and compassion. In your light will we see light.
So the question I guess I have is juxtaposing that remarkable mystical vision of what I would really call the face of the god of war. Can you say more about, in the other poem, Thanksgiving 2018, what it means that you can still hear America singing in her multi-toned voices? What does it mean for you as an American and as a Jew to be writing poetry at this hour in America? And how do you, as a poet, hear America singing her song?
So this poem is really kind of a mixture of it was definitely both with the unconscious and conscious anxieties of influence of Whitman and Maya Angelou and others, and certainly starts with a certain kind of positive cadence, and then also turns to a little bit more of the darkness. Maybe
Right,
maybe
and that darkness.
Yeah.
Maybe go to that section with America screaming in misery, and we'll reflect on that for a moment.
Yeah.
May I please interrupt right now, if you don't mind? And
Yes.
Since you've mentioned Biti Roy, may we bring her into the discussion and perhaps have a three-way discussion, which I think would be very interesting. And so if I may just introduce her, because people may not know who she is, and then please carry on as you are, but I would like her to be part of the conversation. So just a quick introduction. Dr. Biti Roy is Senior Fellow of the Kogod Research Center Contemporary Jewish Thought and the Academic Coordinator and Advisor to North American Seminars at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Israel. Dr. Roy holds a PhD from Bar Ilan University and is a lecturer in the Department of Jewish Thought at the Ben-Gurion University, where she teaches Kabbalah and Chassidut. She was a lecturer, a leader and participant in the very first cohort of the Beit Midrash for Israeli rabbis, and teaches at the Shalom Hartman Institute for various programs in Israel and abroad. She has won several prizes and postdoctorate fellowships, the Kreitman, the Pollack Eliashar at Ben-Gurion University and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her book, which is translated as Love of Shekhinah, Mysticism and Poetics in Tikkunei Zohar, was awarded the Matanel World Union of Jewish Studies Prize for the best book in Jewish Studies 214 to 217. So that's the brief introduction. I would love it if you could all just go on, continue the discussion as it is. Dr. Roy, would you please start?
Hi, this is an honor to be here and to be asked to speak about this magnificent book. I also like my colleagues, and thank you, Glenda and Tara. I'm also like my colleagues are very bothered about what's going on around. And I must say that I feel the broken vessels, this is an expression from Luria Kabbalah, presence in your poetry, Eitan, to all the way. So I was interested in asking what happens when a professor of Kabbalah writes poetry. In the special book in front of us, we have an opportunity to glimpse into Professor Eitan Fishbane's inner world. Professor Fishbein, one of the prominent scholars of Kabbalah in the world today, by publishing his poetry, is letting us inside his deepest life experience. We can now realize and appreciate how much the materials he's so profoundly immersed in for at least the last 2 decades, even though Eitan, after reading the poem about the Gilgul, I'm thinking about what is a decade. We did not just influence, we can see that Kabbalah did not just influence his way of thinking, but provided him with a rich language in which to express his most profound inner self. We can find traits of Kabbalah in both its ancient traditional version and its newer, more modern manifestation all over the book. This is not just an observation on the poems that entitle mystic hymns, but words of Zohar paints the entire book and colors each of its chapters. We find Eitan uses the ideas and concepts from many strata of the Kabbalah, Sefer Yetzirah, Zohar, and Luria from Scott in the 16th century, all are present in the book. The fact of the matter is that we can even see a broad selection of Aramaic Kabbalistic dialects, such as Raza de Shabbat, Arichanpi, Nukba, Butzina de Cardinuta, and etc. This explains how the Kabbalistic language defines Fishbane's personal praise and his deep insights. The professor is a poet, and the poet is a professor. This is not just a pun, but tells us something very important about the way poetry defines Fishbane's academic work. During his career as a Zohar scholar in America and in Israel, we all studied from Eitan Fishbane. He taught us not just about the poetic of the Zohar, but rather about the necessity to research and study this magnificent compilation using poetic methods. This is not self-evident. Gershom Sholem, the founder of the field of Kabbalah, we just marked in Israel lately his 40 years of passing away in many events, actually also around the world, insisted on establishing the historical philological method in studying Kabbalah. For example, his well-known dispute with Martin Buber was very much about his objection in adopting Buber's method of studying Kabbalah and Hasidism through the stories and the literary side of these texts. Another common method of studying Kabbalah, which is to expose its philosophy, or we might say theosophy, that is to say, to organize its theories regarding its main topics, such as creating, God, soul, evil, messianism, etc., as Isaiah Tishby's famous book named The Wisdom of the Zohar presented. As if the Kabbalah is a set of beliefs, and I assume this is understood, this is the understanding of Kabbalah as a corpus of ideas echoes the common idea about the field, one that is echoed by the layperson as well as in the academic world that is not familiar with the area discipline. This and that have now been pushed a little bit aside in nowadays trends. Sholem focused on the where and when more than about the how, not intending to diminish even for a moment his brilliant mind and outstanding scholarship, but sometimes he missed the essence of the Zohar, its emotional techniques, its obvious erotic character, its mystical agenda, as Moshe Eider described it, and the spirit, the Zohar, we might say, the splendor of this wisdom pervades throughout approximately 7,000 pages. Although Sholem approach was necessary for that time, when Kabbalah as a field needed to show academic rigor and maintain a critical approach to the material, and the fact that Tishby's book presented the doctrine of the Zohar in a clear manner was crucial to that time. Later developments in this field showed us different paths of analysis, such as the writing of Yehuda Liebes, who set out to establish a new form of research, insisting that the literal aspect of the book, the stories, and the vivid and the unique poetic content should almost always determine the main method we should apply in order to gain understanding of the corpus. If we can use the popular phrase of Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. Professor Eitan Fishbane followed in this direction and enriched the literary scope of the field, expanded upon this new path for the study of the Zohar, and established with his encompassing milestone work, The Art of Mystical Narrative, in Oxford University Press in 2018. We all studied how we should do it. So the poet and the professor are complementing each other and enable one another. And from a scholarly point of view, Fishbane's academic work is being relieved now retrospectively in his Embers of Pilgrimage. Ember is a well-known symbol for the Kabbalist since Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, to describe things that are embodied in each other, like the fire and the coal that holds it as an ember that is folded in the flame. The latter is pinned, joined the first. If that is so, we might say from the other side that Ember of Pilgrimage is the fruit of Fishbane's work, telling us what Kabbalah is meant to be, creating our life, not in the ancient book, but in the real life of of the here and now. Not a closed wisdom, but a vivid presence in life. Whereas Fishbein summarized this in one of his poems, Torat Chaim, a Torah of life. I would like to focus on two Kabbalistical themes that we can see one is the attraction to what was before and beyond, and the second is the erotic theme. We find on this idea of the attraction of what was before, and the mystery of the time and the place throughout the entire book, acknowledging that there is always something different that throw us to the ancient days or to the days before creation, a veil that encompasses and escorts the author wherever he goes. Echoes the Zohar's explanation to Genesis, that the Zohar explaining the Genesis in the beginning speaks not about the 6 days of creation set in the book, but rather about what happened before. In Fishbein's book, the abyss, the infinite, the myths, the unclear, midrashically speaking, the bet, the start the word Bereshit, that has a line visually in the alphabetical script directing the eye and therefore the mind to what is hidden in time before. But Fishbein is interested in more than that. Is interested in the presence of the beyond in the here and now, the presence of this mystery in the mundane life, in a meeting in a cafe, in a sad moment of his grief, and in walking on the street on a snow day. The second Kabbalistical thing one might identify in the book is the erotic, the love and the erotic present in many of the poems. Sorry, can you hear me? You hear me? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So the erotic present in many of the poem, and is considered one of the peak of human life. Fishbein's echoing the big call of the Zohar to unite, to couple, to internalizing the human life according to this value, to so explicitly expressed in the Zohar. I want to show this in the beautiful poem of the faces. Okay, we are here again. Fishbein, in a virtuosic way, dubbed the archaic figures of one of the most esoteric chapter of the Zohar, the Idra. This secrecy literary and esoteric unit describe the divine not as a solo figure, but rather as a dynamic polyphonic system that is most characterized by its being in a relations between the old face of God to the young stubborn divine, and even changing direction from the patriarchal biblical God to the feminine, including this time feminine sides of the divine, such as the Great Mother and the girl woman feminine, for sure one of the innovations of the Zoharic literature. This interrelational divinity is animated by Fishbein's voice, lacking in the Zohar this imaginable discussion of love and longing and compassion from the old God that contains the bitterness and maintains the wrath of the young angry God. The somewhat abstract appearance in the Zohar is translated in this exciting poem into an intimate discussion between a child to his mother and between a lover to his loved one. This poem is one of the highlights of the book in the ability of Fishbein to maintain the Zoharic setting and to take it another step further, as using Harold Bloom's distinction, which Rabbi Dr. Aubrey Glazer described so nicely in the opening of the book. To my understanding, the one who reads the book is not sure if the poet described his own love or child-parent experience, or the ancient structure that influenced the Jewish world so deeply since the model became so evident in so many communities around the globe. In this poem, the family model becomes so vivid and exposes the divine world and the human world in a nexus that is both provoking and inspiring. Because of the vague meaning of the word mysticism, some gave 26 different meanings, maybe we should call Fishbein's poetry a part of a tradition of Kabbalistical poetry than a mystical poetry. The first Kabbalist who wrote poetry, we can include Nachmanides, that prefaced his commentary to the Bible in a long poem, Ibn Gabirol, who writes his poem Keter Malchut, moving from Middle Ages to Sfat in 16th century. We see empowerment in Kabbalists who writes poems such as Luria himself, the author of Lecha Dodi, Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, a hymn that is sang today around the world from east to west in every Jewish community welcoming the Shabbat. Eliezer Azikri and more. All use the Zohar language, and sometimes even the Aramaic dialect right in their poems. But what about Kabbalist poem in the 20th, 21st century? Yehuda Liebes, one of the great scholars of the Zohar, decided in an uncustomary manner to what was common in academic world in the 80s, to conclude his magnum opus of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the hero of the Zohar, in a poem imitating the Aramaic of the Zohar, but never described his own inner life in a first person, like we find in Fishbane's book. Therefore, Fishbane may be included in another group of scholars of Kabbalah who writes modern poetry, such as Haviva Pedaya from Ben Gurion University, Ruth Kara Ivan of Kanieli, or Zach Smueli from Haifa and Bar Ilan University, Naama Shaketz, Ivan Sheffi, and more, all analyzed in Aubrey's book about mystical poetry in Israel. Contemporary Hebrew, in his book, in the poem Gilgul of Eitan Fishbane, also one of the poems that I love, the Kabbalist Doctrine of Reincarnation, Fishbane describes one of the more complicated and fascinating ideas in Kabbalah that echoes both the idea of understanding our life, as the David Hume, the philosopher, once described as a bundle of impressions. The idea of reincarnation, more than coming back to life, focuses on the evocation idea of the self as an ongoing process through history and the idea of multiple persona in one. I would like to conclude my talk with words of appreciation for this awakening and beautiful book. I would like to quote a few words from Fishbane's poem that brings eternity and real life to one by seeing the life story of an individual as never just what he is, and that he is never one and simple, but carries within him the chain of the generations, carrying and repairing them, all in his own life's challenges. And this is 2 lines from Eitan's beautiful songs. In the dark womb of history and eternity, the same folded naturally and supernaturally onto itself. Thank you very much for this beautiful book, Eitan. I'm looking forward to more books and poems to read from you and your research. Toda rabba.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Biti. It was really deep and beautiful, and really illuminating and meaningful. And also thank you so much, Aubrey, for your deep insights. You're also so perceptive and insightful, and we've had great opportunities to discuss them together. I think since faces has become the theme of our discussion, maybe I'll do a full reading of the whole poem, and so you can get a sense of it in its fullness, and then we can open it up to some Q&A from a conversation from the larger group assembled here. I'd love to engage with you. So this poem, as was mentioned before, Faces, starts on page 59, and I'll skip over the first part, which I did read in full, which started with Zeir on being quick, just in the interest of time, down to where I read, he knows that his heart is full of gentleness and love. It is, she knows it too, she who keeps his secrets. I think that's about where we left off, and then I skipped over to a different couple of lines. So let me pick up there. Do you remember, and this is on page 60, Do you remember the sweet wonder of our youth before the pain and cynicism of life clouded our vision? Are his sleepy eyes and limbs resting from the love they have made upon heaven's ethereal bed linens of light? The psalmist tells of it. Perhaps he furtively witnessed it. He wears light like a garment, the talit like the talit of supernal robing. She strokes his face, his temper calmed in love. The mountain of Sinai first held over their heads, sons of Israel in the desert, now laid to rest on the floor by the lovemaking couple's bed. She coaxes out his better self from deep within. Walled off for so long, once guarded with fearful sentries trained to shoot on sight. And then his gaze turned upward to Arich Anpin, face long with a boundless patience, compassion quashing temper's fire. He is rinsed with the milk of peace, his eyes, his nose, his beard, present and crossroads of all converging time before there was time, and the never-ending anxiety of what will come next or what has passed. Grace overflowing, eternal calm, God like man reaching with luminous yearning to the face of his best self, his higher self, tranquil as waters untouched, and turning to the brilliant, undifferentiated light, rivulets of radiance, where all things merge into one. He prays the words, "Set me free," with countenance and palms turned up, like a dreamy supplicant to the sun or to the source of all shining. From the prison of impatience and rage, liberate me now and wash me clean with your pure stream of love and compassion. In your light, we will see light. And it is a face of subsurface memory from a time long ago when I was nursed as a baby from my mother's milk, face of maternal grace, where everything was still pure with the immensity and wondrous quiet of potential before the hours and days and the years, before memory and time and past and future, before regret and before hope, when dreams lay tethered to the web of unconscious yearning, primal need of the great mother. And here in this time, when one human face looks up from the eyes cast down to look deeply into the eyes of another, pools of light gathering like wells of heavenly depth, or the glimmered reflection of a reservoir of tears unshed, a stream of peace and stillness that just precedes the thunderous waterfall. How many times, how many thousands of times has my own face been reflected back to me in the mirror of 16,000 days that have passed from youth to middle age? Beard of white gray trimmed short this day, of so much time gone by, mixes with the brown and speckled red that still cries out to dominate, as though to say, see the remnants of my youth time, and the masculine strength that still remains and for all the youth that hasn't fallen away. I can see a heaviness in my own eyes, as though the burden of experience and darkness of secrets are held there like they are held in my heart, in the shapes of my son's face, in his joy and his humor. I can see traces of the little boy I once was. And in the eyes, the nose, and the cheeks of my nearly grown daughter, I can see the face of my dead wife, her mother, now buried in the ground for more than 13 years. But hers is also the face of dreams, of life just beginning to open the petals of time, of becoming. Arich Anpin, face of patience, slow to anger, glowing in the otherness of this person who stands before me, human, mortal, vulnerable, and still the face of infinity and justice demanded, commandment, covenant, love. Arich Anpin, the face of kindness and calm deep within, releasing the fire heat and smoke of pent-up angers, leaving the pure exhale of meditative peace, love, only love. Arich Anpin, restoring the name of God, torn and burned to ashes in the blaze. The sacred letters, Yod and He, ripped from the words where they first dwelled. Arich Anpin, reminding me now, as perhaps I knew then, that I and you each are called to the force of this cool white flow of grace, giving in virtue and in patience, calming the embers of a fire, hushed and tamed, but still warm. So, having read that, and having heard all of the deep insights of my dear colleagues, Glenda, if and Thea, if it sounds right to you, then maybe we open it up now for if people have some thoughts or questions they wanted to ask. Does that sound good?
Sure, yes, go ahead, please. Anybody who has questions or some comments to make, just put your hand up, please. We can't see many of you. If you would like to put your question into the chat column, please do so.
If nobody has question, perhaps Aubrey will start it off, please. Thank you very much.
Sure, with pleasure. It was wonderful to hear that poem again, Eitan, and just to go through, as Biti was reflecting on the power of family within your poetics and returning to this, in many ways, what we would say is the divine family of persona that you evoke here. And I guess I want to just bring it back to the opening part of the conversation, which is that in a time of war and a time of love, a time of living and a time of death, that so much is on our minds. Great poetry really begins to clarify the direction in our groundless space of the mist. And I wonder, given that we're talking about this in an interfaith forum, maybe if you might reflect a little bit on where that final face or the other faces that you feel are relevant, but it feels to me like the conversation that I started with you was about the god of war, which really was the face of Zeir Anpin, of the impatient, vengeful, warlike god. And as I listened to you reading about Arich Anpin, the face of kindness and calm, deep within, releasing the fire heat and the smoke of pent-up angers, which really is that god of war of Zeir Anpin, do you think there's anything we can learn from the mystical poetics of the Zohar, and specifically in your rendering of faces, that might speak to pilgrims on the Abrahamic pathway, about what it means to turn to a different face of God in a time where the one that's being presented to us so bombastically is so full of war and blood and tears and suffering. Is there anything we can learn from a reappreciation that you are inviting us to consider by contemplating Reincarnation at this hour?
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Aubrey. And I've been thinking a lot about this, and also in relationship to other colleagues who have written about the theme of love. Right, love is in the title of Biti's great book, as well. But also thinking about, right, if that poem is about this complex Tselem Elohim that we experience, right? This kind of how, just like there are these different dimensions of divinity, so too there are these different dimensions of ourselves, right? And how do we balance these different emotions, sometimes overflowing with the Zeir Anpin energy, and hopefully more of the time calmed by the love and compassion of Reincarnation. And I'm reminded of that wonderful passage at the beginning of Tomer Devora of Moshe Cordovero in the 16th century, where and he's really talking about this a similar domain of divinity, that highest domain of divinity, which contains the 13 attributes of compassion. It contains the Yud Gimel Midot HaRachamim, which in the Jewish liturgy is recited so much, especially on the days of awe, Yamim Noraim, but of course is also biblical. And he says there that fundamentally, just as all of the sfirot of God, all of these different dimensions of God, are filled and shaped by that first primal force of compassion and love that flows forth from the very beginning of God's infinite energy, before there was any division, before there was any chesed and gevura, right? Any love and severity. And so in thinking about how that impacts the human self, he says, right, that you should also try to embody those dimensions in your life, and always try, even when there are different parts of divinity that you're embodying, different parts of the sphere of the one God that's reflected in all of these 10 sfirot, these 10 dimensions, that let it all be ultimately grounded in compassion, in Reincarnation. Let it all be ultimately grounded in love and empathy and compassion, something that we need so much in general in our lives, and all the more so, right, in moments of crisis, where we need to bring that virtue spiritually and morally to mind and to heart. And I think it's actually one of the great things, one of the great pieces that unites different theologies represented by many of our people in the audience here. And I won't read the poem, but toward the end of the book, there's a short poem called the Dao Sheffa Grace, which in an interfaith context, I think is especially helpful to think about, right? That there are these different ways of talking about this flow of energy from God that can be deeply healing and restorative, and filling us with a calming sense of and centering sense of love and compassion toward the other, toward ourselves, right? Because we need to be able to give love and compassion to ourselves before we're really able to give it to others, as Buddhist thinkers and others have taught us. But or to be able to center ourselves in that and then to overflow that energy, but to always be able to receive that, right? In the Zohar, and then later it talks about Arich Anpin as giving that milk of peace, as I mentioned in the poem, right? It's like that's the symbol of this kind of calming energy, which is kind of like that, which is kind of like that maternal energy as well, right? As Biti was alluding to.
But it's so interesting. Just maybe to close, one final comment. I know the hour is late, but there's a sense of unity that comes from the nourishing milk of that facet of the divine, that it's maternal, and yet there is something I just can't help but see. And this is just one moment, again, reflecting on this hour, the amount of unity that came through at the State of the Union address, where across the aisle, everyone managed to somehow come together in this unifying moment. And you see it in times of war, that not only is it the facet of the divine, where it's the maternal and the milk that nourishes us all as human beings, but there's something profoundly real, direct, and incredibly disturbing. And Whitman touches on this too in the poem that I read from Drum of Taps, is the blood of Zeir Anpin that also unifies a kind of tribal mentality. And there's something just very human about the way that we are drawn, and that we oscillate between the need for milk and the primal magnetism towards blood. And I guess in this hour where so much blood is being shed, I wonder, how is it possible? And maybe the answer is through your poetry and other great poets like you, who are yearning for more of a turn towards the maternal, or maybe more of a turn towards Arich Anpin, which is that calming presence that can somehow balance and maybe show us the way home. I just think of that image that of Whitman as the poet tending to the soldiers of the Civil War, and noticing the fragility and the vulnerability of what it truly means to be human. And maybe what I would offer is that by reading strong poetry like yours, Eitan, and going back to Whitman and forwards to some of the great Hebrew poets that Biti mentioned that I've also worked on, and Mystical Vertigo, maybe that's one of the solaces that we have in this hour, where so many of us are struggling to find the presence of the divine in a world where it feels like it's eclipsed. Maybe we can encounter it through words of poetry, and perhaps, if we dare for a moment, to hold them in our hands, in our souls, like the Embers of Pilgrimage that you're offering for us today. And so I'm super grateful for this gathering, and also, Eitan, for you making this offering possible for Panui to bring out into the world. And I trust and hope that it will reach many, and that it will inspire many to turn towards that calming presence of Arich Anpin, and really bring healing and hopefulness to the darkness of this hour.
I don't think that I could end this gathering on a better note, or to improve on what Rabbi Aubrey Glazer has just said, which I heartily and sincerely echo. And I would like to thank you and Eitan Fishbane and Biti Roy for the most illuminating and interesting evening. And there is so much material here to think about. I wish we could go on and talk about it and discuss it, but as I said, I can't end it in any better way than as Rob Aubrey has done. So I would like to thank you very much, and to thank Eitan very much, and to thank Biti Roy, if I may, very much indeed, for a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you all very, very much indeed.
Thank you, Glenda, and thank you, Thea.
It's been lovely seeing you again.